Minecraft 26.1 updates the data pack version to 101.1 with new world clocks and data-driven villager trades, among many other changes. My name is Sly Slime and this is a showcase of the changes. Let's start with the world clocks. Each world clock contains an internal time, and that time regularly increases every tick, but clocks can also be paused and resumed using commands. Defining a world clock is done by adding a file to the world clock registry folder with a JSON object. However, the format is currently empty. By default, there are two world clocks, the Minecraft Overworld one for the daylight cycle, and Minecraft the End, which now controls the timing of end flashes. Timelines now also specify which world clock they run according to in a new clock field. They also have a field for another new concept, time markers. A time marker assigns a name to a specific time in a clock. Examples of such markers are the names that are available to the time set command, like day, night, and noon. Each time marker has a ticks field for the time it represents, as well as a show in commands boolean that determines if it's available when time markers show up in command syntax. The show in commands field defaults to false, and time markers also have a collapsed form when they are specified as a number, which represents the ticks field. Note that time markers are specific to the world clock, even though they're defined in the context of a timeline. That means only one time marker can be defined with a certain ID for each world clock, but the same time marker ID can be used for several different world clocks. In addition to the names used in the time command, the game also uses two built-in markers called Wake Up From Sleep and Roll Village Siege. And dimension types now have a default clock field, which specifies which clock to use for the built-in marker checks, as well as the default for the time command. This is an optional field, and if not specified, the time command needs the clock to be specified and the built-in markers never occur. Dimension types now also have a has Ender Dragon fight boolean value. And speaking of the time command, as you might imagine, it is also affected by this change. Most forms of the command now have an optional argument right after time of clock ID, which lets you specify the world clock the command should affect. There's a new pair of subcommands pause and resume for pausing and resuming the passage of time within a certain world clock, and the set and query forms now take time marker IDs rather than a predefined set of names. Time set used with a marker ID now advances time to the next repetition of that marker instead of setting the time to the first repetition, and time add can now be used with a negative number as well as a positive one. The return value of add and set is now the total amount of elapsed ticks of the affected world clock. Instead of the day and daytime query forms, you now query a specific timeline, and there's now a repetitions subcommand that lets you query the number of repetitions of that timeline. There's also time rate, possibly with of and a world clock ID before rate. This allows you to set the rate at which a world clock advances, ranging from anything above 0 through the default of 1 up to a maximum of 1000. Note that this doesn't change the tick rate of the game, only the rate at which that particular world clock advances. If you do not specify a world clock ID, the default one for the current dimension is used. And with that, we're done with world clocks. But not done with commands. There's a new swing command. It can be used to make entities that can swing, swing. The arguments are an entity selector for the entity that should swing, and a specification of which hand to swing. There's a new subcommand for fetch profile called entity, which prints the profile information for a player or mannequin entity specified as a selector. This is now also accessible using control and pick block as an operator to trigger the same result. If you use commands to put armor on a baby wolf or a saddle onto a baby pig, that no longer renders. This version removes the villager.equipment slots and replaces them with mob.inventory. Which is now used to access slots both for villagers and for piglins. Some default block states have also changed. If not specified, the rotation of banners and signs is now 8 by default rather than 0. Which trades the different villager professions use is now data-driven through a couple of new registries, in a similar way to loot tables. You can even think of them as a sort of trade tables. Each entry in the new villager trade registry folder is a JSON file which describes one possible trade offering.
It has fields for what the merchant wants, as well as what the resulting item for trade is. This is described using a gives item stack plus a given item modifiers list of modifiers, which are item modifiers, also known as loot item functions. Whether this trade is available is controlled by the merchant predicate, which is a loot condition predicate for the merchant entity evaluated when the trade is unlocked. The reputation discount and double trade price enchantments fields control the price of the resulting item, the max uses field controls the available stock, and the XP field controls the amount of XP the merchant gets when the trade is used. Another new registry is called Trade Sets, which controls which groups of trades are available to which merchant type. Each trade set has a set of trades, the amount of trades to unlock, whether duplicates are allowed, and a random sequence ID used for the randomization. Currently, the only trade sets that are used are the built-in ones for all villager professions and levels, as well as the Wandering Trader. There is a related item component as well. Additional trade cost, which is a transient component only used while trades are being generated, and flags that the trade should get a higher cost. The die component has been added and is now used instead of die items specifically. This version also changes a number of item components to now accept either a single ID or a list of IDs for fields that previously only accepted tags. The same thing goes for a change to loot tables. The set instrument function's option field now works the same way. The set random dice function has been added to randomize die colors on items. The set random potion function has been added and sets a potion contents component from a set of options. Enchant with the levels and enchant randomly both now have an additional boolean field that makes them set an additional trade cost component on the item. This version also brings improvements to the player entity subpredicate, which now has an optional food field. When present, this is a predicate on the player's food values that can check either the food level or the saturation. There is a new loot predicate type called environment attribute check in this version, allowing you to check the value of a given environment attribute at the position where the loot table is being evaluated.
And the time check loot predicate now has a clock field specifying the world clock.
There's also a new environment attribute number provider, which gives the value of a given environment attribute.
And there's sum,
which adds a number of number providers specified in the summons field. Recipes have been updated in this version, with all recipe types that have a results field now having the format of that field unified. They all now accept the short form for a single item, and ones that did not have a count field before now do. The show notification field that was previously found on crafting shaped recipes has been added to a whole range of other recipe types. The crafting special map cloning recipe type has been removed, and those recipes are now instead crafting transmute recipes using new functionality to specify material count and whether material count affects output count. The new crafting die recipe type replaces crafting special armor die and can be used to add dyes into the dyed color component from the dye component of ingredients. Crafting Imbue replaces crafting special tipped arrow and copies the potion component from the source ingredient to the results. Smelting recipes now handle the count of items in the result properly. In addition, ingredients and results can now be configured for a number of the special recipe types. That includes banner duplication, book cloning, shield decoration, decorated pot crafting, map extending, and the various firework recipes. And finally, the group field has been removed from recipe types that don't have a recipe book, and a number of vanilla stone cutting recipes have been renamed. This version brings us 3 new environment attributes, adding onto the system added in the last version. They are all RGB colors specifying the block light tint, the ambient light color, and the night vision color.
In custom world news, all dimension data is now stored the same way regardless of if it's a custom dimension or a default one. For instance, overworld data is now found under dimensions/Minecraft/overworld. Data in the top level data folder is now exclusively the data that applies in all dimensions, and this data is now found under namespace folders. The level.dat file has been updated as well, with lots of specific data moved into separate data files, and player storage has been moved to the players subfolder. There are updates to several of the feature formats. The tree feature now has a below trunk provider instead of force dirt and a dirt provider.
The flour, no bone meal, and random patch configured feature types have been removed. These types can instead be represented using the count and random offset placement modifiers. The flour feature-specific functionality of being spawnable from bone meal has been replaced by a new configured feature tag called can spawn from bone meal. A number of features have been renamed and generalized, so Forest Rock is now Block Blob, with fields for which block state to place and what it can be placed on. Ice Spike is now Spike and now also has fields for the state and what to place on, as well as what can be replaced. The two huge mushroom features now also have can place on fields. The count field for count placement modifiers is now limited to a range of 0 to 4096 instead of the previous 256. And news for state providers. There's a new type called rule-based state provider. This was previously separately parsed for the disk feature but can now instead be used anywhere. They also now have an optional fallback that can be empty, and if so, they place nothing. There's also a new int provider in this version called Trapezoid, which mirrors the functionality of the already existing Trapezoid float provider. And saving a structure from a structure block in the world now saves the structure in a folder named structure rather than structures. In entity data news, some of the data about fall height and explosion impact positions have been moved from being exclusive to players to existing for all living entities. The ignore fall damage from current explosion field has also been removed. This datapack version introduces two new particles, pause mob growth and reset mob growth. Mob sound variants are now data-driven for cats, pigs, chickens, and cows. For cats, chickens, and pigs, these formats are split into sections for baby and adult sounds separately, while for cows, the fields for sounds apply for both babies and adults. Wolf sound variants have been updated, with the sound fields moved to adult sounds and a second field added called baby sounds. Let's talk about dirt. In specific, dirt-related tags. A number of features which were either hard-coded or part of concepts like dirt have been split into separate tags, including what types of vegetation blocks can be supported and which blocks can be used to grow crops. The dirt block tag has been split apart into multiple tags. Collection tags mud, moss blocks, and grass blocks all contain what it sounds like they should, and the dirt tag now only contains dirt, coarse dirt, and rooted dirt. There are a number of new tags with more specific purposes that reference these. Substrate overworld is used for world generation conditions, and there are a number of tags used in feature placement for the various meanings of dirt. There are 3 new tags for which blocks pumpkins and melons can grow their full blocks on top of.
And a new block tag for prevents nearby leaf decay.
The mud, moss blocks, and grass blocks collection tags also exist in item tag forms. Bubble column generation is now also controlled by tags instead of being hard-coded to magma and soul sand. There are also similar fluid tags for which fluids can support lily pads and frog spawn, as well as which ones are needed to support sugarcane, and which fluids bubble columns can exist within.
This version also contains new tags related to the new data-driven trades.
That includes a host of new villager trade tags and the potion tags, as well as the removal of trade-specific enchantment tags, which were only used in the trade rebalance pack.
And there's metal nuggets, which is all the items that can be used for crafting name tags.
The dyeable item tag has been removed, and a new set of specific dye-related tags have been introduced. There's also a new cannot be age-locked entity type tag. And a change to text components. Tags resolved from NBT text components with the interpret field set to false are now pretty printed instead of being flattened into a single text component. And there's now a new plain option to remove the styling from pretty printed text. This option is mutually exclusive with the interpret option, only one can be true. The selector and entity fields no longer accept trailing data after a selector. The NBT and block components now properly show errors if the parsing fails. The object type player component is no longer allowed in server message of the day fields. Object components now also have a new fallback field, which contains a text to use when the component itself can't be displayed, like in server logs or when narrating the message. This fallback field is now also used instead of player heads when they are not allowed. The game test environment type time of day has been replaced with clock time, which also has a clock field to specify which world clock to set. And game test environments can now set timeline properties in a new timeline attributes definition type.
And that's all for this pack version. Thank you for watching. My name is Sliced Lime, and I'll see you next time.